Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. There's going to be quite a lot of content today because a lot is going on. We're going to be doing a military aid video now, but before we go into the long weeds of the details of what each nation is doing and whatnot, someone sent me this on Blue Sky that I think is fantastic. It's a really, I think it's Welsh Troll on Blue Sky. It's a really arresting visual representation of the losses, but also the military aid and whatnot concerning the Ukraine war. 3 years of the Russia-Ukraine war. And we can look at losses here. So over 1.1 million casualties. Remember, casualties are dead, wounded, POW and deserters. And here we have 70,000 Russian soldiers killed. And of course, you can argue these numbers, but they've just gone with what the sources: New York Times, BBC, UALosses.org, Kyiv Independent, Media France 24. So, you know, looking at all those sources, they say, right, 70,000 Ukrainians killed, 190,000 Russian soldiers killed, and then wounded 390,000 Ukrainians. And we have 500,000 Russians. And it says here, approximately 50% of wounded return to battlefield. You can question that with regard to how many Russians are sent back to the battlefield on crutches, etc., etc. One head represents 1,000 people here. So there you go. That's a visual representation of losses. And then for some context, here's some comparative loss stats from other conflicts. Combatants of the mentioned nation killed. So the USA in World War II lost 405,000, that's killed, and 384,000 for the UK in World War II killed. I didn't know that the Americans lost more than British soldiers in the entire World War, so that's an interesting statistic. And then, goodness me, Russia lost 20,000 in Chechnya, 15,000 in Afghanistan. The Afghanistan war was much longer than this present one. So it shows you how many people are dying in this war compared to previous Russian conflicts in modern history. USA lost 35,000 in the Korean War, and both sides have, at least doubled that. Now, and USA in Vietnam lost 60,000. So that the Ukrainians, as according to these stats, have already surpassed the USA losses in Vietnam. Russians are well past that, at least 3 times that. Anyway, those are the losses. This video is, of course, as you know, about military aid and whatnot. So it's worth looking at the economy for either side here. Russia, vastly 11 times larger than the Ukrainian economy. Its military spending far outstrips the Ukrainian military spending, although the Ukrainians have really caught up. So at the beginning of the war, the percentage was fairly similar of GDP, but of course, since the economy is so much larger for Russia, the percentage then translates to a much greater number in terms of billions, so $65 billion in 2021, whereas the Ukrainians were spending $6 billion. That's before the war. 3% of the economy 3% of GDP, for the Ukrainians, are 3.5% for the Russians. But then where are we at now? Well, there's a huge increase from the Ukrainians at the beginning of the war and a moderate increase from the Russians. And that increase has gone up fairly steadily, although this year is estimated to be a slightly bigger step there, leading to the Russians spending 6.3% of GDP. That equates to $145 billion. The Ukrainians spending 28%, so almost a third of their GDP spent on the war. Military spending, $54 billion. But of course, the size of the economy means that 6.3% of a much bigger economy gives you a much bigger number than 28% of a much smaller economy. So that now it's looking like it's about 3 times the difference between the Ukrainian expenditure and the Russian expenditure. But of course, this means that in relative terms, the Ukrainians are far outspending the Russians. In real terms, the Russians are outspending the Ukrainians. It's gone from 11 times the size of the economy to 3 times the size of the spending. So you can see, what the Ukrainians are having to do to match the Russians on the battlefield. What's it? Percentage of Ukraine occupied by Russian forces? Not too important for this video. So we'll then go to military aid to Ukraine. So the US has given $69 billion, and there's lots of argument about this. And in fact, we're going to go through this because arguably that is a vastly overstated number. Nonetheless, This is coming from, I wonder, numbers are estimates and averages from quoted news stories and studies. I wonder how much, Kiel Institute, CIPRI, New York Times, Ukraine losses made its own, US Congress, Le Monde, CSIS and UNHCR. Okay, so military aid from the US, just assuming that these are correct then, 69 billion, Germany 13.6 billion. Of course, it's then about the size of the economy, GDP, and also per capita. The USA is a bigger country with a much bigger GDP. But then you've got UK, Denmark, Sweden, Poland, Netherlands, France, all these other countries, other EU. Then you've got the EU itself, which I don't think is included in there. And you've got non-European countries, Canada and Australia, and then other countries, very small down there. But yeah, I think that you probably would need the EU because the EU is directly funding as well. But then as a percentage of GDP, now this is really useful because they don't do this on the Kiel Institute. They have the EU as a percentage of GDP compared to each other, EU countries. They did used to do this, but they stopped doing it. And this is really useful to see where the US sits as military aid as a percentage of GDP. And this is what the Americans need to, not the Americans, this is what Trump needs to be told. You say you're doing all this and all that, but actually the USA has given the most military aid in absolute dollars, but many other nations have given more as a percentage of their economy. And, you can't see, Pearce, get your head out the way. I would forget that. So let's do that. So as you can see there, the US sits below many of these other nations. So we talk about Germany very favorably and the UK very favorably. All of these nations that give the most amount of stuff actually as a percentage of GDP are relatively low down the list. In fact, it's Denmark. Denmark are the guys that we need to be celebrating big time. So not only do they give quite a lot of stuff, $8.1 billion worth of aid, they are top of the list in terms of as a percentage of GDP. So they're not only a meaningful supplier of aid, but they're also, of what they're capable of giving, they're giving the most. And I think that's brilliant. So Denmark, total props. Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Finland, Sweden, Slovakia even, that was from the beginning of the war, more than now, obviously. Really good stuff. Now, there's lots that can be said about this and lots of asterisks there attached to all of these data points. But really interesting. Good to see that this website, and I love what they seem to be doing here. What do we have? That's losses, world's leading natural gas producers, loads of other graphics. That's from last year, graphics. But yeah, I think that this is really cool, interesting stuff, and a good way to start this video. Okay, and now we're going to go on to Politico reporting that the new 20 billion military aid package to Ukraine from the EU, and that's thought to be, there have been rumours that it's going to be between 30 and 40 billion. Whatever it is, there are issues with getting it through because, not everyone's happy with it, and the EU is a collection of these different nations. Now, the structure of Callas's proposal, which is based on countries' gross national income, is designed to force nations to contribute their share. So that's kind of what we're just talking about. But some countries, Italy, Portugal and Spain in particular, are balking at the request. Interesting that those nations are the ones further away from Moscow. And there is, as the Financial Times has shown, there is a correlation between the amount of aid people are prepared to give to Ukraine and their proximity to Moscow. So Italy, Portugal and Spain in particular are balking at the requests, seeking to bundle the aid package with larger questions about how Europe will finance its defence build-up. So there is a delay there, frustratingly. No report says Italy, Portugal and Spain are not yet supporting the $20 billion euro aid package to Ukraine. According to Politico, the countries insist the aid should be considered alongside broader European defence funding. And we have some more details on that there from the Politico article, so you can read that at your leisure if you want. I'm going to move on, but it's rather frustrating. And we also have Max24 in giving all sorts of summaries from yesterday, saying in 2025 it's planned that Ukraine will receive $1.5 billion euros, and I guess that's from a number of different nations, for the purchase of Ukrainian-made weapons according to the Danish model, which is investing in Ukraine, getting them to spend money on their own equipment, generally speaking, and that's seen as a Danish model. As I've explained before, ideally from your own personal point of view, from Denmark's point of view, they want to spend their money in their own economy to provide Ukraine with weapons from Denmark. But if you have a small defense industrial base, or you've kind of exhausted what you can give to them, they need other stuff than what you can provide, then the next best thing is to invest in Ukraine so that they can buy their own stuff, or ideally make their own stuff, and therefore those dollars or euros end up multiplying within Ukraine in terms of tax and supply chains and stimulus. And then the third best thing, the last best thing, is you invest, well actually no, from a Danish point of view, then the next best thing would be to invest within the EU. And then the next best thing is to invest in the US or any other given country. So anyway, Ukraine are going to receive 1.5 billion at least from this kind of Danish model approach in 2025. What else? We're going to come to some of these. I've talked about how Friedrich Merz, the incoming chancellor, or I guess, is he officially the chancellor-elect? Probably not official. He's looking at getting 200 billion euros in as a defense budget initiative by pushing something through now before the new government takes shape, because when that takes shape, you'll have AfD and Die Linke probably voting against that. So before they come in with the existing parliamentarians there, he's going to try and get that done, but he might have some issue with that. What else have I not spoken to you about? Most of these other things I spoke about yesterday. Okay, Poland is pledging a new military aid package of $210 million. This is a 46th contribution, and we will continue to help, says the Polish Defence Minister yesterday. That is good. I don't know what's in it, though, I have to say, but good news that they're getting a pretty sizable package from Poland there. Now, the State Department officials want to unfreeze USAID to Ukraine, according to, again, Politico. I presume these are State Department officials who are kind of existing ones, not part of the new Trump administration, the new influx of personnel, because this is aligned with support for Ukraine, right? These exemptions would extend beyond the US waiver for life-saving programs and would allow Ukraine to receive funding for demining, narcotics control, and civil society projects. I expressed to you about a week or two ago, referring to Brendan Kelly's Substack piece, 50 organizations, 50 projects in Kherson alone that rely on you, or not rely on, but they are benefiting from USAID funding. So 50 projects that's in one town, one city. So you can imagine the amount of USAID involvement right across Ukraine, and for the State Department want to unfreeze that. That's good news for Ukraine. Don't know whether it'll happen, but fingers crossed and all that. Right, the Norwegian NASAMS, which is also the American NASAMS, it's a co-production between the two. The Norwegians call it the Norwegian. The N stands for Norwegian. The Americans change that to national. Anyway, the NASAMS air defense system has apparently shot down 900 targets in Ukraine at an effectiveness of 94%. That's brilliant. 94% shoot down rate, I think it's pretty good. So NASAMS definitely a boon for the Ukrainians. Now, the Bundeswehr, the German army, has officially revealed for the first time the number of air defense missiles they have transferred to Ukraine for the Patriot and the IRIS-T SLS and SLM air defense systems, short range and medium range IRIS-T. They have given 658 IRIS-T SL missiles and 328 missiles for Patriot. So that's impressive from the Germans there. Really important munitions, those. IRIS-T, obviously one of the mainstays of the German contributions, but Patriot, obviously, is super important for the Ukrainians. The only thing that can shoot down ballistic missiles, well, SAMP-T can as well, but they've only got a couple of SAMP-Ts. Patriots Pack 3 can shoot down ballistic missiles. Pack 2 less so, and that would probably be a mixture of Pack 2 and Pack 3 missiles. I speculate. Right, German aid to Ukraine then states today an EU delegation has handed over 25 Volkswagen Amarok. We were due to take out an Amarok when we drove out 3 vehicles, and then it had a problem with its ignition, so we swapped that over for an L200, I think, a Mitsubishi. So yeah, that's by the by. 25 VW Amarok pickups, co-financed by the German government, to the National Police of Ukraine. That's fantastic news there. And this is then an example as well of stimulus, isn't it? You know, you go to one of your car manufacturers, car industry's flagging a little bit in Germany, as an understatement there. So, you know, going to them and say, right, we'll have 25 Amaroks, we'll send them out to Ukraine. It's going to be useful for Volkswagen in that case. In 2024, Ukraine received about 1.5 million shells under the Czech initiative. 500,000 of them were, we'd already known that, but interesting that 500,000 were 155 mil shells. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that the other other million were 152 mil shells, which would be Soviet era shells, because you can get 105 mil, 122 mil. You can get all sorts of different caliber of barrels and munitions. So yeah, I don't know, but I assume that means they're also procuring an awful lot of 152 mil shells, Soviet era stockpiles, for the Ukrainians as well. Okay, Ukrainians have released this image of and I showed you yesterday that Zelensky was talking through a lot of their new defense tech and showing it to the congregated world leaders that came along for the 3rd anniversary. You've got Justin Trudeau there. You've got some Nordic leaders I can see. Yeah, but anyway, he's showing them there an underwater drone, the Toloka. So it's going to be fascinating to see actually, it might have already been used, who knows? But what the capabilities of that is, or capabilities are, I should say. Yeah, they are doing an awful lot of innovation, of course, as you would assume the Russians are too. Now, continue talking through some drone nuggets. A few months ago, says Oliver Carroll, Russia's drone production was running at 30 to 40 a day. It's now 150 a day. So this is a worry. This is a Russian thing. It's the only Russian thing I've got, actually. Ukrainian intelligence sources tell me Russia has plans to go to 500 a day. We shall see on that. The explosive payload is also increasing today. You're seeing 90 kilograms instead of 30 kilograms. So that's multiplied by 3. David Hambling here who writes for Forbes. So simply huge numbers of drones coming from Russia. 177 last night, 176 claimed down. So those are Shahed drones. I don't know if these numbers include Shahed drones. They're saying 150 a day drone production. So I guess that is, because they're talking about 90 kilograms instead of 30 kilograms, that is going to be attack drones. I guess that means that some days you'll get 267 and other days it's going to be less than 150. That's what they're producing a day. That's how maths works. But that is worrying for the Ukrainians. It now appears that the Ukrainians are using the Tunza 120mm self-propelled mortars. An unknown number of them have been added to Jeff 2146's list of equipment delivered to Ukraine, and these are Bulgarian. So here we have an information sheet on these. These are a 1980s Bulgarian self-propelled mortar in service from 76 to 81. In service now, but developed from 76 to 81. And they were produced from the 1980s to the 1990s, not produced now, but still in service. And at least several dozen were produced. So not many of them produced, but some of them at least in Ukraine at the moment. So that's good news for the Ukrainians. Starlink has now formally come out and said it is fully committed to providing service to Ukraine. Any rumours to the contrary are categorically false. I speculated something the other day, which actually, interestingly, Jake Bro repeated, he didn't repeat me, but he's got the same idea, that it could well be that the American administration did threaten the Ukrainians with pulling Starlink, and then Starlink went back to the American government and said, yeah, but please don't, because we will lose a load of money and it's also legally very problematic. And that's what Jake Bro said. And, it would invalidate these kinds of procurement orders. So Poland is to transfer 5,000 more Starlink terminals to Ukraine. And remember, it's not so much about the cost of the Starlinks, but it's the subscription. Each one of those will bring with it a monthly subscription, which I assume Poland would be paying for. And if the US were to cut the Starlink provision to Ukraine, then that is coming out of Starlink's pocketbook, or that's a potential loss of income to Elon Musk Starlink. And, when you start looking at Tesla's doom and gloom stats at the moment, he's probably thinking, I need all the money I can get. I don't want to be staring a gift horse in the mouth here. So Poland transferring 5,000 more Starlinks to Ukraine. That is good news for Ukraine. Talking about Starlinks and alternatives, why Ukraine? James from Why Ukraine just contacted me and said, look, I'm doing something at the moment, can't really tell you much about it. I'm doing some fundraising for it at the moment, which you can check. This will be listed below. He said, look, there's an alternative for Starlink that we are going to be rolling out more than just my unit, but I can't really tell you much about it. But anyway, that's what we're doing. So nudge, nudge, wink, wink, wink. So there are things afoot for alternatives for Starlink. But yeah, you can go and check out James on his website and videos as well, no doubt. Now, he's now serving with the Birds of Fury drone brigade out there, drone units out there. Kyiv Independent reports that Poland, this is not so much, it's tangentially linked to the war in Ukraine, but it's of note. The Polish are adapting all civilian airports for dual military use. Now, earlier on in the war, I reported to you that NATO were doing an investigation into really how war prepared they were. So if there was a war in, say, Eastern Europe, or say that NATO were called to provide assistance in Ukraine, how able would NATO, would Europe be able to move equipment across Europe? What does it look like to move equipment across roads, across railways, using airports, marine transport? And actually, it's one thing saying, yeah, we've got NATO, yeah, it's all cool, and we've got all this stuff and all of us are working together, and then war happens. You're like, who's actually done any research into whether we can move all our crap from, I don't know, from France across to Ukraine? Right. And so to be war ready, you need to be thinking in terms of logistics, of course. And so Poland making all their airports at least like available for dual use, able to be used by the military, is really important. Every airport must be adapted in some way to the possibility of cooperating and working with the military, according to the Polish defense minister. And I think that's invariably very sensible. Okay, we're going to move on to peacekeeping forces. The UK and France are ready to deploy peacekeepers to Ukraine only if the US guarantees their protection. Trump has refused to provide such guarantees, and Macron has failed to secure concessions. Both are requesting US logistical, intelligence, and military support. Okay, yep, we can imagine that's going to be necessary. We will deploy our forces to Ukraine if we receive American guarantees. That's what Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, has very explicitly said. And a French Finance Minister, Eric Lombard, has said that he expects the US to provide backup for European troops to maintain peace once a ceasefire is agreed between Russia and Ukraine. But then we hear, this is coming from the Wall Street Journal, that Trump's plan for a settlement in Ukraine does not include US commitments to send forces to the region or provide assistance in the event of hostilities. And that is obviously going to be a bit of a sticking point, because if security guarantees from Europe depend on support from the US, and then the US are not going to provide that, and if NATO's off the table, then there are no security guarantees, which means there's no peace. So the US holds the key to peace, arguably, in terms of whether they do or don't supply those security guarantees themselves in some way. Worth noting this as well, and this is, again, not particularly to do with the war itself, but it kind of goes to this point that of there is a dependency on the US. The US provide things that we can't always do ourselves, because they have the capabilities, the capacity that Europe doesn't necessarily have. Shashank Joshi is quoting from the Times here. In January last year, HMS Diamond, so that's a Royal Navy destroyer, patrolled the Red Sea, helping to defend against attacks from the Houthis. But to do so, it was entirely dependent on a US supply ship for food, fuel, and ammunition. And again, here we're seeing just in normal military activities of the UK, the dependence we have on the US in this example. So if we're going to provide peacekeeping troops to Ukraine, we're going to need some assistance from the US, and the US are, whether they like it or not, key to peace. But that key is them actually stepping up with some of those guarantees. Now, moving on to US expenditure and whatnot. Anton Gerashenko here is, well, actually, this is quoting President Donald Trump. Quote, "We're spending hundreds of billions of dollars on Ukraine and Russia fighting a war that should never have happened, blah, blah, blah." So what we're doing is now we're saying we want to be secured. We want to get that money back. There's your problem. They want that money back without understanding that it was a mixture of grants, loans, aid, just general, I wouldn't say charitable assistance, because it's within the strategic objectives of, or it helps to achieve the strategic objectives of the United States. The problem is, if he's saying that, then every European nation or every nation that has helped Ukraine, going back to here, every one of these other nations can do the same. And since that's pretty much the same assistance, and arguably more if you look at other analyses, and we're going to go on to say actually the US one should be cut in half there. Well, in fact, economists are now saying that theirs amounts to 18.3 billion in military aid. Then actually that's deeply unfair for everyone else. And that's kind of where we're going to go. Okay, so the EFU has stated that the cost of, that's Economist for Ukraine, the cost of US aid to Ukraine is half the official estimates. The actual cost of military aid to Ukraine is at 18.3 billion instead of more than 60 billion announced by Washington. The main reason for the disagreement is the inflated estimate of old American equipment. Also, some of the aid comes through allies, and only a small share of it reaches Ukraine directly. Over 3 years, the US has allocated 50.9 billion, of which 32.6 billion went to budget support. So when a lot of that aid actually goes into upgrading your own armed forces, then it's kind of disingenuous to say that's aid to Ukraine. So therefore, but then if it's to replace stuff that you've given to Ukraine, then surely that's fair. But if you were going to get rid of that equipment anyway, and you already had in line to replace that old stock with newer stuff, then that is kind of what your DoD budget was going to be, anyway. So it becomes really tricky to work out exactly how much money you are spending on Ukraine that you wouldn't have otherwise spent. And that's a point. So what the US were doing, it's not necessarily a criticism, it's just what they were doing was using Ukraine aid as a way to expedite upgrading the US armed forces just slightly quicker than they would have done it, and getting rid of older and obsolete equipment. Not all the time, but sometimes obsolete or older equipment. So Andrew Chakian here says a few numbers to consider when talking about USA to Ukraine. $250 billion or $350 billion or $500 billion or whatever, $200 billion even. And these are bogus figures. $80 billion is the book value of dispersed funding according to the USIG report. So it's Inspector General report. Okay, so you've got $80 billion. 18 billion is the actual value independently assessed by a group of economists, 18.3 billion. PS also Europe gave more. So don't want it to get in like a competition between these two entities, but it's really important. So when you've got Donald Trump very publicly slagging off Europe and saying that we've given way more than Europe and Europe hasn't given enough, when you've got an analysis to say actually Europe's given more and what you say you've given is not only false, but even at the kind of official figures that are scare quotes correct, those are not correct as well. So we need to get a fair understanding of how much you have actually done for Ukraine, because then when you're demanding you want payback for this because of all the amount that you have given, if we find that to not be very much, then when it comes to the minerals deal and these demands for payback, then these are deemed as even more unfair. So it is important to get this right. More important to be critical of the US evaluations because they're the ones asking for it back. Like the EU is not asking for it back. UK, France, Germany, whatever, they're not asking for it back. So we could do the same kind of analysis for those entities, but it's kind of more abstract. It's just like for the sake of accuracy, then let's do it with them. But it's not for the sake of accuracy here. Well, it is that too. But it's importantly for the sake of you guys demanding crazy figures back. We need to know the reality. So Jane Keeves says a group of economists unearthed a scam that screwed Ukraine out of billions, marking up old decaying weapons 3 times the value of their new version. So he's quite critical about this. He's an American, by the way. We have performed an independent analysis based on publicly available data. Our findings, and he's referring to this. This is comprehensively valuing Ukraine aid and economic approach from Economists for Ukraine. So, yeah, we have performed an independent analysis based on publicly available data. Our findings show that in 3 years of full-scale war, the total monetary value of USAID delivered to Ukraine's government amounts to 50.9 billion, of which 18.3 billion comprises military aid, and the remaining 32.6 billion is direct budget support in the form of expense reimbursement through the World Bank and collateral for loans. These figures, in particular the military aid component, differ from the appropriation amounts by a factor of 2 to 3. The US government has valued its military aid to Ukraine at 65.9 billion, whereas our estimate places it at 18.3 billion. The discrepancy between the appropriation amounts and the values computed in our independent analysis stems from 3 main factors. First, the majority of US military aid to Ukraine has come in the form of existing equipment from US stockpiles. When we track every weapon provided and consider the vintage of these weapons, their full depreciation and their failure rates rendering equipment unusable by the US Army, the value is at least 60% less. Second, where aid consisted of new equipment ordered, the US placed significant limitations on Ukraine's choice of weapons and their use, and some of the equipment transfers have not yet occurred. Third, a substantial portion, approximately 25% of the military aid, was provided in the form of loans rather than grants. So when you've got Donald Trump then saying, well, Europe has just loaned everything, they're going to get it back. We haven't loaned it, so blah, blah, blah. And that's when Emmanuel Macron corrected Donald Trump. Actually, the reality is that I'm going to say hello back again. The reality is that the US has also loaned equipment rather than granting it. So we discuss these factors in more detail in section 3 after presenting some background information about USA to Ukraine. And then in the background information, I'm just going to pick out these bold statements, as in they're written in bold. The United States government did not just transfer funds directly to the government of Ukraine. Substantial portion of the United States aid to Ukraine has been in the form of military equipment, munitions and related services. Ukraine has been subject to extensive audits as an aid recipient. There's been no evidence of issues or anomalies, and the United States has provided less aid overall than Europe, which is the EU plus UK, and I guess plus Norway as well. And then it goes into the specifics on USA to Ukraine that drive value discrepancies, talking about direct funding, loans, collateral, treasury accounts, grants, direct equipment transfers, indirect equipment transfers, lend-lease, and although that was unused, as it mentioned, and foreign military assistance loans. So there you go. It's if that analysis is to be believed, then the US really need to reassess where they're at and the rhetoric of people like Donald Trump. Fascinating stuff. And Jane Keeves, as you can see, is, pretty angry about that, as others are as well. Okay, now the UK has has increased its defence expenditure, looking to get to 2.5% of GDP by 2027. We knew this was coming. There was no timescale on it. Previous Conservative government had made that commitment by 2030. Now the Labour government has moved that forward 3 years, which is welcome. But it's difficult, and we're going to look at how it's difficult. But let's be clear, the trajectory essentially allows the MOD to maintain programs and plug growing holes in existing force structure rather than any dramatic change, such as backfilling for American assets in Europe. He says more dodgy maths too. An extra 0.2% of GDP is around 6 billion, i.e. the cut to the age budget. Yet Starmer trumpeted a £13 billion increase in defence spending. Seems to make sense if one thinks the defence budget would otherwise have been frozen. And the UK last spent 2.5% on GDP on defence nearly 20 years ago. So this is getting back to where we were actually under the last Labour government. And since then it's gone down. It would have gone down during the Labour government though. So 2.6 in 1995, to 1996. So they came in 1997. So actually they precipitated it going down, then going up, then going down. And then Conservatives came along and a bit of a bumpy road, and then down a lot since 2010. And then it's been going up a little bit over the last couple of years, and then it's due to go up more. Okay. Now the problem is that the UK has no money, and this is so what Keir Starmer's done, and this is relevant for all countries giving aid to Ukraine, but particularly European countries who recognise they have to up their defence expenditure, but they have a competition for those funds. Those funds are finite, and it's got to come from somewhere. And basically the UK, and this has been controversial for some people. Last 24 hours, there's been people from the charities sector coming out, and rightfully, they're defending their own interests, saying, hang on, you are literally taking money from USAID budget. It's not USAID, but it's the equivalent from the UK foreign aid budget, and you're moving it to the defence budget. And I can see that there would be criticisms. Ordinarily, I would have been someone doing that same criticism. But now I'm in a point where I'm realistic about what goes on, more realistic. And that money has to come from somewhere. If you are a government that is wanting to get re-elected, you are not going to take that money from schools, from hospitals. And sadly enough, the easiest place to take any kind of major budgetary, any major money from, the easiest department is going to be the foreign aid, because your domestic voters are going to be less worried. That's going to affect them directly less. This is why we've seen USAID get swinging cuts, because actually the everyday American voter is going to care less about that expenditure than expenditure on Medicaid and whatnot. Problem is that's really important. It's not that much money in American terms. Actually, USAID is a very small percentage of the budget, but it does an awful lot. So it does a lot of heavy lifting in terms of international soft power for the United States. And the same can be said about the foreign aid budget for the UK. If it's well spent, that is money that is very useful. But if a lot of that money is going to be spent abroad, you're thinking, well, we're going to take that money okay, there are charity workers, many UK organisations that are going to be doing that, and they are going to lose money. But we're going to take that money that is at least somewhat spent abroad, and if we can ensure that money is spent within the UK, and we're going to start spending on UK manufacturing rather than just buying American goods and whatnot, then we are not only putting more stimulus in the UK, arguably, but you could argue that those charities might spend that more freely rather than concentrate it in a big multinational like BAE Systems or whatever. So there are lots of arguments to be made about this, but they are taking it from foreign aid and putting it in defence. It's just a like for like switch. I understand why they do that, and I understand they have to do that because they've got no money. There just is no money in the UK budget, and they need to grow. The whole plan for the Labour government is the economy grows, and at the moment it's flatlining. So we need to get closer to Europe is a general consensus. We need to get closer to Europe to increase our economic outlook, improve our economic outlook, and then they're taking money there from foreign aid and putting it in defence. Is it enough? No. But in order for it to be enough, you've got to find that money from somewhere. It's going to be deeply unpopular when you start cutting into things like health service. But as you can see, health spending has gone up and then gone down. But it's still, we're getting an aging population. We have to spend, we need tax rises in the UK. But they don't want to do that because we're at historically pretty high tax rate. The realistic position from my point of view is that life is more expensive now because we live longer, and we don't have populations like that, we have populations like that, and therefore if we are not getting a tax revenue from a massive base down here of young workers, and we're saying no to immigration that does something about that, then we need to pay for this growing set of people up here. And the only way you're going to do that is by raising taxes. If you're not going to do immigration and we don't have birth rates to support that, then you are going to have to raise taxes. It's just one way or another. We just live in a more expensive time. Our health is more expensive than it's ever been because we're living longer, and therefore you get things like cancers and this and that, and then you have to treat them. It's really interesting. I won't go down. I won't go off on one. But the point is, I think every country is going to have to grapple with increasing retirement ages and increasing taxes. And if you don't do that, you are going to have an economic black hole, especially when you're limiting growth because you've come out of Europe and that was our major marketplace. So, for the UK, there are some difficult conversations to be had when you're saying we need to raise defence spending. And that'll be the same for all nations. China has rejected Trump's proposal. He said the other day, because he's tasked Pete Hegseth with cutting the American DoD budget, Department of Defense budget, by 8% every year for 5 years. And then he said, hey, but I'm going to get together with Xi Jinping from China and Vladimir Putin from Russia, and they're going to agree to cut their defense expenditure in half. And I was like, no, they're not. They are not. Don't be stupid. That is naive. And then they've said, China said, no, we're not going to do that. China is spending way more than they ever have done, and they're also hiding a lot of their budget expenditure in other pots. They're hiding how much they're spending on defense. So they are catching up quickly with the US, and the US is now cutting defense and cutting everything, and possibly looking at doing things that are recessionary. So I could imagine, if in the worst case outlook for the US is they go into recession, they're slicing their defense spending, they're slicing their foreign aid, USAID, and intelligence, CIA, counterterrorism, all of this stuff, making the world much more insecure and giving them much more influence in the world, and they'll be struggling. As I said in my previous video, the US is doing everything they can at the moment to look like they are trying to support Russia and China. Like, everything they're doing appears to be to the benefit of Russia and China. And China are going to be laughing all the way to the bank. Now, China are in trouble with their own population demographics and their own economy. But they are living under a dictatorship, and they'll find it somewhat easier to deal with that. Now, here is Europe. We have happily paid 3 times as much to Ukraine as the USA, says this person, not asking for anything in return, and we are not extorting the Ukrainians while they are fighting for their lives because we are not arseholes. It's not just this person standing saying this. That was Rasmus Jarlov, the chairman of Denmark's Defence Committee. So when you got a major country coming out and saying the US are extorting and they're arseholes for doing that, again, it goes back to this idea that they appear to be doing everything in support of Russia and China. Real criticisms that are coming out of the US, their positioning and what they're doing at the moment. And I think rightly so. And Michael McFaul, again, the former ambassador to Russia is saying now that Trump has established a precedent of getting refunded for past aid to Ukraine, can our NATO allies ask for repayment for the cost of their military operations in Afghanistan for our defence? So not only have I said the minerals deal, which my breaking news update actually looks a lot better now, but if you see it as an extortion of Ukraine and repayment for past aid to Ukraine, which is unfair because you've already given that aid. You can't then go back and say, oh, now we want payment for that unless you're running a protection bracket. But if you are doing that, then Europeans are going to come out and say, well, hang on, we've given Ukraine all this. We want our money back for that. And then you get situations like the Danes, the Germans, the Brits going to the US and saying, well, we came to your help for the Article 5 invocation after 9/11 and we went and helped you in Afghanistan. We want payment back for that. And then obviously they could say, well, that's Article 5, but then we could say about what the US are doing now, well, that's the Budapest Memorandum that you signed up to. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander. I think it's a really dangerous precedent that the Americans have set there. But it does depend on whether Zelensky has now really changed that minerals deal to be much more of a cooperative investment in Ukraine's reconstruction. And if that is the case, and it's looking more like that's the case at the moment, then that's excellent for Zelensky to have changed it from extortion to cooperation. Now, just one thing on disinformation. This concerns aid to Ukraine. That's why I'm including this here. You know that Twitter has this thing called community notes, where if someone spreads disinformation, you then do a community note and it gets upvoted and whatever, and then that corrects. It's like an open source correction of whatever the disinformation is. Charlie Kirk spread this disinformation. Ukraine aid is a perfect example of how America used to always get ripped off. America gifted Ukraine 250 billion in munitions and aid, and we've already shown that's disinformation, so somebody's calling this out, but got nothing in return. Europe loaned 145 billion in financial and military aid to Ukraine. America's done being taken for suckers. So Charlie Kirk is spreading this disinformation. It was then called out by community notes. America has not given 250 billion in aid. 120 billion has been delivered, of which 20 billion are loans. Europe has provided 136 billion, of which 60% is gifts and 40% is loans, but most of the financial aid, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so it was corrected. And that was then spread by Elon Musk, and he said it's very one-sided, and so he's deleted the community notes. So no longer is this the marketplace of ideas and people open source correcting disinformation, because Elon Musk gets to just delete things that he doesn't like. I don't like what you're saying there. And I'm a free speech absolutist, so I'm going to censor you. So he's taken out that community notes. He's censored it. Absolutely outrageous. Elon removed community notes about being fact-checked about Ukraine funding because he's a disinformation agent. So just be careful. Not only is Elon, as Tennessee Holiday here says, amplifying inaccurate Charlie Kirk tweet, he appears to have had the community notes removed. That's something that we have seen before Elon Musk do, and it's happening still. And when it's with regard to Ukraine, it's particularly galling for me and for you guys, I'm sure, because we are so invested in this war and the accuracy concerning the war. Yeah, there you go. Anyway, thank you very much. I really appreciate your support. Take care, guys. I'll speak to you soon. Don't forget that there is a Jiggers Paw campaign fundraiser that we are involved with here as a team here at ATP Geopolitics. It's for thermal drones. Just over 10,000 being donated. If you do donate, please remember to press the copy ATP for Triad comment button there, and that will copy that text, and then you can put it in whatever field is relevant in your payment details, whatever you click on. You have to do that for the money to be attributed to our campaign. If you've forgotten to do that, just reach out to them, let them know, and I'm sure they will assign that payment with the missing details to ATP Geopolitics. Make sure that your name is on here, so to make sure that was actually done. Although kind of some of these names have been fully censored depending on what you put. If you put "don't put my name," then it will have no name there, but you might be able to guess the time and the amount. Anyway, that would be really great if you can help us out with that campaign. as that's really good for these units to get these thermal drones, and then they match it with Ukrainian donations, so it'll be double what we do, and that's part of a $300,000 overall campaign. Anyway, thank you. Take care. Speak soon.